Hey, it's simple. You're watching Thorin channel.
Right, this is going to be another episode of Know-It-Alls of CS with me and Tommy here. Now, obviously, this is the season where every other talk show all has the same theme, where it's like, who is the number one player of the year? Who is the team of the year? Who is, whatever, the breakout player of the year or whatever. The usual, like, award season trash, basically. Or people attempting, and I noticed, by the way, they never put in the due diligence you need to actually do this right, attempting to do a review of the entire year without reviewing the year, and therefore just off the top of their head at the end of December, trying to, like, remember things that happened. And so, as you'd expect, it's all just like mad recency bias and like I saw people trying to make a case that like Navi was one of the best teams of the year. It's like, mate, they only got it together like the last third or something. Like before that they were non-existent. So anyway, the point I'm making is we're not going to do that, but we might talk about some of these discussion topics as this, like a tangent to broader topics, because that's the point of this show. We kind of go a bit deeper, or we take it a bit more meta. So one of the things I wanted to talk to you about actually is one of the things that we've had a back and forth about a lot over the years, because you were one of the first people who was interested in the premise of stats. I'm talking about even the most basic stats. Like obviously in CS, if people don't know, in CS there didn't even exist stats until something, I think it was like 2006 or something that got fragged in it. I think that was the year they began, or 2005 maybe.
Even that wasn't like good coverage. So we didn't really have like proper stats until like 2010, 2011 is when HLTV started like covering every tournament. Before that, it was just like hit and miss.
Yes.
Like you'd get the big CPL, SWCs, WCGs, but like that was just about it. Like you wouldn't really have anything else.
And it goes without saying that, like, if you know the sports terminology, what we actually have in CS in terms of what is on the standard sites like HLTV, the big stats that you see on screen, they are by no means advanced statistics. Like, those are actually the most, by definition, the most basic stats. Like, how many kills, how many deaths did he get, or the differential, which is just obviously a fucking addition or subtraction. Like, it's very simple. Even, like, the closest you get is with things like the KST, where obviously that's like HLTV's attempt at something approaching like a PER format, if people know basketball. They're trying to find like a killer stat. Obviously their rating tries to do something similar, but the problem with those advanced stats especially is, unless I think personally you've actually been in the back end and you know really what it's controlling for and how it works, it's kind of tough to kind of like, in English you'd say, like, put that as like make that your main thing, basically. Like, to me, you can only, that's like sort of saying like, I trust this guy's an expert, so I sort of put weight in his opinion, but he's not me. So at the same time, I can still disagree with him, or I can still think we're saying nonsense. So where I thought we'd go with this is, I wanted to get your thoughts, because basically I started at a position just because that's why it's actually funny that fans in the modern day think I care about stats and stuff. Maybe it's because I like build myself as a historian, because I came from the most extreme position back in the day, which I would almost, just for comedic purposes, describe as like, I've thought of myself almost as like a Gnostic, where I had to have direct experience of the godhead of esports, and it was only my direct experience that mattered. And then through that, I went through the position of, obviously other people have their opinions that can have some weight to it or merit. And then in later on, I wouldn't say I've ever fully taken stats like that hardcore, because I have like a different perspective to most people, which is I think stats are great for starting conversations or pointing like an interesting direction. But I notice most people use it for the opposite. They use it to tell them where they end up and then what the answer is, this is kind of the point I'm getting to here. So I've come full circle through like a whole process of trying to use different things, and at the end I'm right back at the beginning, and basically, without exaggerating, I kind of do make the majority of my decisions just based on what my eyes tell me, the eye test, and essentially just how my brain processes it. Now I am kind of cheating in that sense, because I wasn't born yesterday and this isn't my first year watching Counter-Strike. So what I'm basically saying there is, I'm just going to trust my brain to be like a supercomputer that's doing something akin to taking in the most basic stats, and basically I'm basically saying my brain is Thorin rating whatever 20.0, whatever year it'd be, 19.0, and that as a result that's the ultimate test for me personally. So where do you come down this? Where do you come down the concept of the eye test? Because I know you like put some merit in stats, but even then we've never had like a big discussion about it, just on Twitter, so I don't know how far you go with that. So where do you sit on the whole stats thing?
Well, I mean, first of all, I think I think I once wrote an article just kind of like talking about the like comparing eye tests to.
This was on HLTV back in the day?
Yeah, I think so. And I think the main conclusion that I came to in the end, I can find the link later if needed, was something along the lines of, particularly today, like previously you'd have HLTV, you'd be able to watch every player, you'd click around frantically during the game and you'd actually see much more of what's going on. Now that you're watching streams, you're kind of, you're just stuck watching whoever
Yes,
happens to be
true.
on the screen. You really only see 1/10 of the game. You see some of the other stuff that happens from that player's perspective and the radar, etc. But like, really, you're missing a big picture of the game. So, what I think stats are very helpful for is, one, you kind of get an idea of what else happened that wasn't directly on your screen. Obviously, lacks much of the context, or all of the context, really. At least the stats that are publicly available on like HLTV, for example. I think what stats are very helpful for is just looking at a bigger picture, a larger data set. So, let's say let's say you want to just compare 100 players. You're not going to be able to watch demos of those 100 players playing. Now, like, if you're familiar with the players, like if those are 100 players from the best teams in the world, you probably have some opinions on most of them, if not all of them. So, you might just be kind of refining. But I think data is generally more useful when you just have a lot of it, and you can kind of just get some conclusions derived from it. But like, even like Daryl Morey wouldn't tell you that like he's just making all the basketball decisions for the Rockets or now the Sixers just like based on the stats. I mean, a lot of it is driven by that, but I don't think that's the only thing. I think it's helpful in many ways, and if you have like actual advanced stats, you can kind of uncover some things that may not be so easily visible or noticeable by others. But I don't think either alone, the way that most people have access to eye test today, can really decide anything. It's a little bit easier for, if you're saying ZywOo against Simple, like those guys are on the screen like half the game when their teams are playing. So you see much more of what happens there. But, if you're comparing the fourth, fifth guy on whatever team to another team, like those people, you don't really see them play a lot of the time. So I think for players like that, I think it's more useful to have stats. And I think you kind of need to see more than might be visible in the streams. I think if you're one of the big guys, you probably get a pretty good idea of how well or poorly they're playing just based on watching the games.
Yeah, that's actually where I'll clarify my statement then, because I guess in that sense I didn't end up entirely where I began at the beginning, because at the beginning I used to basically just ignore the stats, like I just didn't care. I only used to really look at them to see if someone did something crazy, like, had like an absurd amount of ADR, like that's how I could basically tell back in the day if someone was just like 1v9 in all the time if you hadn't watched the game yet. Like if they have insane ADR and it's like MSX or something, they probably did just have to carry that whole game, didn't it? It probably isn't that, it's just like farming equals or something. But the problem I have with it is where I came close to my original position is, like I say, I incorporate it more along the lines of, like, to me, this is basically the premise that I made in like a video years ago. It was actually, I think, in League of Legends though, I think. Where the premise to me was, stats are really good at like suggesting questions. They're actually terrible at answering questions, in my opinion. Like, I'll give you an example. Just from life, in fact, as a businessman, you should be able to appreciate this. You know that famous thing that a lot of people do, where a decision comes to them in their business career, right? Could be like get a new job, could be do something in their business that might be like expand into a new area or hire a new employee. And because it's a big decision, they do that thing where it's like, right, I want to think about this. I don't want to make a snap decision. I want to, take a couple of days. I want to sleep on it, as we say in English, right? And even though I certainly think there is like a whole side tangent as to like ways that that's beneficial. Like, for example, one thing I never used to do back in the day, but I'd certainly appreciate now, is the premise of like, don't make a decision based on emotion and stuff like that, like, because obviously that can be fleeting, whereas in the moment it feels really vital, but 2 days later you might think, actually, just thinking about it without that emotion in my body, why did I do that deal? Like, I shouldn't have. So the premise I'm getting to is this. I kind of have a similar philosophy with big decisions. I actually think 90%, maybe more, maybe 95% of decisions I make in my life, because I know myself well enough, I could actually make them snap the second you ask me the question. Like, if you ask me now, do I want to do a business with you, or do you want to do this? Like, because what you're asking me is, do I want to do it? Like, would I like to go in that area? Would it be something I want? I could say yes or no now. And even if I went away and thought for 3 days, it's unlikely I'd come to like a radically different decision, put it that way. I might like tweak it a little bit, like maybe there's caveat I should add or some afterthought. So basically, I actually think most people, when they take those days, aside from beneficial things like maybe they don't know themselves as well, that's a way of describing it, or maybe they would have acted on emotion. Aside from those side issues, I think most people realistically are doing, to tie it back into what I said at the beginning, I think they just go away and they look at other reasons than what they want to do for why to make the decision. So for example, I think what they really do when they go away like that is, it's like that classic thing where you say in English, like, it's your head versus your heart. What they really mean is they know they want to do that deal, but they're trying to think of a reason why they shouldn't do it. Like, well, I know my dad would have told me, don't do this deal, or, play it safe, son, or maybe a better thing will come down. In my opinion, opinion, you're just trying to talk yourself out of it when you take too many days at it, you know. So you're trying to find a reason not to, because if there's a million reasons to do it, you just do it, like, you know, you just know instantly. So basically, to come back to it, like, that's the issue I have, is I agree with you in general. Like, for example, if it's a match I haven't watched, of course I want to see the box score. Like, I'm not going to watch that match. I've got to have some info on it. So it might be good in pointing me in the right direction. But basically, I think ultimately it always comes back to, like, I mean, the problem here is terminology is a bit dodgy, but like intuition or however your brain figures it out. Like, I think in the end, all the really meaningful qualitative judgments just come from you.
Yeah, I will say that, like, there's a couple of things that also skew the results of the eye test, if you will. So, you know, like, there's a couple of blunders too many that happen to a player that can really skew how people view them. I think that's something that actually probably.
Oh, of course, if you do a massive fuck up,
off the top of my head, but
no,
I
get it. Yeah,
there's probably a bunch of players who have had a couple of unfortunate highlights on, like, the other team or whatever that they've paid for, because that just kind of skewed how people perceive them as players. But I mean, I tend to agree big picture. I just think stats are very helpful for just kind of getting you started, at least, like, getting in the right region. But then, you know, you can't really base anything off of stats. Certainly not the publicly available ones. You know, like, it's crazy to me that we still don't even have on HLTV stats, like, you know, adjusted for the equipment value that the other team has. I mean, it's absolutely bonkers to me that you just can't look how players are doing against, you know, ecos, against force buys, against full buys, you know, depending on what equipment they have. We've talked about this previously, and, you know, even going back to the 1.6 days, when I think it was the first year when Navi had Navi won basically everything 2010. And I think all of their players except Senia were in the top 20 list for HLTV, and we're kind of like, well, like, sure, because it's, you know, it's circular. Like, if you win a lot, you get a lot of ecos. Like, Zeus plays Inner on Train, he gets a lot of full eco rounds there. He gets 4 or 5 kills every round. That, you know, you get one of those every single game, and that basically moves you from the average player on your team to, like, the top quartile player overall. And, you know, like, if that happens enough, like, for example, that year in particular, you know, like, Navi just steamrolled everybody. It wasn't even close, except for, you know, say the MTW games, but, like, they had a lot of easy games that, like, really, really skews how you look statistically. And it's just a good example of, like, how the numbers by themselves don't necessarily do a good job. With that said, you know, like, if you just needed to know, like, okay, who do you think were the 20 best players of this year? If you look at even the sort of rudimentary stats that are available, you'd probably be, you know, fairly close.
You'd
get
most of them, probably, I'm sure.
I mean, like, there would be, you know, like, you wouldn't agree on the order. There would be some that you probably would have left out. You would have put in whatever. But I think, generally speaking, you probably wouldn't be very far away from the list that you would have gotten if you just had started working from the other end. So, you know, I think the big picture, you probably get roughly in the right place. But I think I just think you just don't see most of it from stats. You just, like, there's so much more to the game.
With that said, though, the one area where I actually have come a little bit more towards your side than back in the day is, after enough years of looking at the CSGO stats particularly, there's definitely some kind, it's probably not a super strong one, but it's at least like a medium correlation between things like how much can you frag, what are your differentials, etc. Obviously, these are all based on role, and there's, like, a lot of specific aspects, but if we're talking more generally, there clearly is some sort of, like, at least a medium strength correlation between those and, for example, how important are you to your team, or how like, good a player you are overall. Because basically, like, the simple way to say it is this. It's like, I once heard a comment like this said about Ronaldo, like the Portuguese one in soccer, right? Where people who don't like Ronaldo, believe it or not, right, used to say this. They would say all he does is score goals. And someone pointed out, like, yeah, but that is like 90% of winning football matches, though, isn't it? Like, and that because obviously football's an extreme example where, you know, you can have possession for 90% of the game, but if they score the 2 goals and you score the 1, your possession counts for fuck all. Whereas, like, in a sport like basketball, if I had possession 90% of the game, like, I don't think it's even possible for you to score more points than me, probably. Yeah. It's like, it's probably insanely difficult if it's ever even happened. So, like, in that scenario, right, I kind of do think there is something like that in Counter-Strike. It's one of the reasons why, if you notice, I'm one of the areas I try to do actually quite diligent work is in trying to explore who are the players who are overrated and underrated. Because if you notice, they tend to be the same players. It's just how you set the discussion up. So I'll give you 2 examples, right? People either think that RPK is the most underrated player or the most overrated? Because if you only care about numbers, he never has that very good in terms of fragging. So if you think frags matter, that's kind of the point I was making about the Ronaldo one, in the same sense as goals matter incredibly massively in soccer, even though there are a million other slight details that are important in soccer. In the same way in CS, you can do as many beautiful things. I mean, you know, this is an IGL. You can do as many great things as you want on a T side. If you don't win the round, it means fuck off you got the bomb. That means fuck off you got the 2 entry. You know, like at the end of the day, some of those things don't have the value that they might in the minutiae. You know, like at the end of the day, sadly, the star player who wins the 1v1 might be the most important player at the end of that round. Doesn't matter what had to happen. So, like, I noticed with certain players, RPK Zipnix is a classic one because I personally think that, like, I get why people thought he was underrated before, because if you only looked at stats, you don't see what he does. I think he went the other way. Now he became the most overrated player. Now he's like all those fuckers in the NBA who are like 6th man of the year, and then people are like, they should put him in the starting lineup. It's like, dude, you're understanding the premise of what he does. Like, the whole reason he's getting those
backups.
Yeah, Lou Williams isn't going to get those numbers if he started in the NBA, you idiot. He gets those in like he gets that when the other stars go out of the game and he just feeds on the shitters, doesn't he? Like, so anyway, yeah. you get where I'm going with this as a principle. Like, there is some sort of a correlation, clearly. Like, for example, I know Astralis is a great example generally for this, mate, because there's a million angles. But the other one is this. Everyone used to try and say during the peak of Astralis that I should stop saying Device is the best player because, you know, they all have such unique qualities, and, you know, a lot of them had, like, some of them would have like different matches where they would top frag. And I was like, yeah, but at the end of the day, the guy who gets the most frags is still Device. He has to do it the most consistently, and that's why he's getting all the MVPs and why we're going to call him the best player. Like, where do you come down on that? Because basically what I'm kind of leaning into there as well is how much the CS is fragging.
So, I mean, I think fragging is like if you only had to get one variable to try to guesstimate how good somebody is, I think that's the one that you would use. There's no question about it. I think the interesting thing that you kind of alluded to but didn't necessarily really touch on is the thing that's really hard to figure out, and I think is probably potentially the most valuable thing if you could kind of learn to approximate that or, you know, estimate it better, is who's actually capable of having a bigger role or being better than how they're currently being used. So, for example, like, you know, going back to what I was, you know, the Daryl Morey thing that I said earlier, you know, like James Harden, a bunch of people thought he was the 6th guy. A bunch of people thought he was going to be another Lou Williams coming in, scoring 20, 25 points off the bench, and now he's one of the best defensive players ever. And, you know, like, don't have to like how he plays basketball. Yeah, you don't have to like how he plays basketball, but, like, he's every night when I look at the box score, I turn the TV on that channel. He's at 35 points with 15 shots. Yeah. Like, that's just what he does. So, like, you know, that's like a good example. I think there's some others who, you know, like you picked out players like ZywOo. He's one of the guys who got picked out of, you know, it's like an FPL player and like a.k.a. like a bad French team, looked amazing against bad teams. But there's a lot of players who looked amazing against bad teams and just like never amounted to anything. You know, they got picked up by good teams and then they just looked average. That's the part that I think is just like, it's just hard to tell because there's a lot of, you know, for every ZywOo or every Coldzera who comes out of nowhere and is instantly incredibly good, you know, there's 30 other guys who get picked up and they just can never make it work.
Because the reason why I bring that one up is if you're going to talk about those top 20 lists, and I agree with you, by the way, especially, I mean, there's a cheat built into this, which is in the modern day, all the analysts look at the fucking stats after every game anyway. So unfortunately, like at the end of the year, it doesn't matter if we went roughly based on the top stats. Like they would already be picking, they sort of preloaded to base it off the stats. But ignoring that, I agree generally. Like if I sat someone like Maniac down and I didn't let him look at all the stats now, but I just said, listen, you've got 10 minutes, just write down 20 names and they have to roughly be the 20 best of the year. Now, the point is, yeah, if he had the stats in front of him in a whole like 5-hour session, I'm sure there's a couple when it gets down to like 19 and 20 as the numbers where he'd think about it for 20 minutes and he'd go back and forth and he might change his mind. But I agree. I'm going to guess off the bat, like 15 of them immediately, first of all, he'd easily get. And then secondly, would probably overlap with whatever I would pick, even if I haven't talked to him and I have no idea where he's at on the matter. But actually, that's why I bring up the example of the RPKs. The Zipnix one's probably the best one. Because, dude, where do you come down on that? Because I actually think in a world without stats, someone like Zipnix would get way more plaudits. I think he would automatically get like top 20 status because you know how even analysts think about that guy. They always use this logic of like, but without him, Astralis would have lost the game. Whereas I did a whole text piece on this. I'll link it in the description. My article was this, right? I pointed out, yes, he's a brilliant player, a mate, blah, blah, blah. I give all the praise you need, but I also pointed out, and we're just going to pretend this is a one-way relationship. Like, he benefits in every single sense from every teammate he has. What doesn't he benefit from having Zonic and Glaive and fucking Device? And, like, mate, give me a break. Like, people were acting like, only his part counts and then everything that sets him up to that point. So where do you come down on players like that where it's like, first of all, they clearly do have more value than the raw number can show. But my point, which is kind of what I'm adding in there, is my problem with Xyp9x is this. He's in a situation where basically everything he does amazingly, it's like Dennis Rodman in those Bulls. You only get to see the upside because they cover all his weaknesses. You never have to see him show weakness. My problem is this. Take a few players off his team and even replace them with statistically identical players, but they just aren't those same teammates. And I imagine he couldn't do certain things more. Like, I don't think he could do what Device does or some massive fragger. So when you come down on a player like that where it's like you obviously want to give him the credit, but can a player like that, even if the numbers aren't crazy, be like a top 20 player for you? Where do you come down on that?
I just think it's hard, to be honest, because I think to be one of the top 20 players, I think you have to be like the second best player on like a championship team. Like, you have to, I think. Like, if you can't be the second best player, or unless you just have like a phase 2017, was it the year that I think 2017, unless you have a team like that, like if you just got to be one of the top two guys on a really good team, I think. If you're not even necessarily the third best player there, I just don't think it's possible. I think that at that point, like, that's either you have the all-time greatest team, which, by the way, in that case, like, they actually do, but I still don't think it's relevant. But like, I just don't think that's reasonable. I think, we've had this specific conversation once with Semler. I remember outside of a hotel in Stockholm when we were talking about I think the way we framed the discussion was, let's say we break apart every Counter-Strike team in the world and we're basically drafting players to field new teams. And I don't remember whether the context was, like you get them in this age or for one game or, just like for the rest of their careers or whatever. But like we started talking about that. And I remember the way Semler framed his answer was something along the lines of like, well, like I'm going to get Xyp9x and then I'll just have the best support player.
He meant first. Yeah, exactly. Like number one just like, in the draft.
Okay, but like by the time you're picking your best player, like Simple and, now I guess ZywOo, Device, Coldzera, all these guys, Nico, they're going to be off the board. Yeah, you have the best support players, but you have none of the stars. Like, how are you going to win? Like, you don't see a lot of these teams without the superstars also. Like, the superstars are prerequisites, and then you can have these nice little luxuries on the side. So I just think, I think he might be, Xyp9x is a very good player. I don't think he's one of the top 20 players in the world. I think, and I don't think that's like, that's not meant as like, oh, he's not a good player. Like being one of the top 20 players is really hard. But like, I just don't think that he could have a large enough role in a separate team, in a different team, to really, really warrant that status. And like, it's a team game, sure, but like I just think there's many more players who could potentially have a much larger role and a much more important role. And I agree, like, he does benefit from having a very visible role in the way some of the rounds are won. And like at the same time, I think, whoever has crafted a narrative, like, I think it benefits greatly from the fact that he is kind of expected to not put up numbers. He's just expected to win those clutches. So, while, you have players who are not fan favorites in the same sense, like they have the same, weak stat line sometimes, they're, 8 and 10 at the end of the half. People will be like, okay, well, like he just screwed this up for his team. If you look at Xyp9x, you remember that one round because he gets every single clutch because of the way he plays. You remember that one round? Well, he won that round for them. He's done what he's needed to. And I guess like Device and Dupree just needed to get more kills.
I'll use another example of an Astralis player, actually, because obviously, like, it's best to use the players people have seen play so they know roughly what we're talking about. One of the things I noticed was a difference between me and a lot of other people is when 2018 happened, the year when Astralis won all that shit, basically. At the end of the year, I noticed most people actually agreed with, I think HLTV had the same opinion. They had the second best Astralis player after Device as Magisk, because I think stats-wise, he had like a slightly higher rating or something. But I actually had Dupree. And so basically what I'm going to lead into now now is this is also another aspect that like the eye test actually is it's at the moment without some sort of super advanced metrics, which you could do in CS, by the way, because actually a side tangent, what makes CS different from real life is we control the universe in CS. Like we can actually literally tell like where something is in a vector. Like we can only gauge these things in real life. We have to use like lasers and shit in real life to guess those things. So actually in CS, in theory, we could track things like we could use like heat map concepts to check like space creation. Again, more things that are obvious things that we should have, but we don't basically. But we don't have that, right? So instead what we do is we just use those terms loosely and we use the eye test to tell us who creates space, who occupies that space, who benefits from that. So to me, basically what I'm leading to is the reason I actually had Dupree as a better player than Magisk is because when I looked at how amazing those T-sides were of Astralis, and then I saw that, guess what, my old boy Dupree sometimes was on hard entry duty like the old days. I was like, mate, some of the I have this concept I use now for players like this, where I say, like, some of his kills go on someone else's part of the scoreboard. So, like, I know at the end of the game, the number for the guy behind him is way higher, but, like, it's basically it's the argument we always made against Forest back in the day. It's like, mate, you were in the dream position to get the most kills. Not everyone else who was competing with you was in those positions. So, like, how do you come down on stuff like that? Because obviously the angle there is, even that concept like space creation, it's already a very vague way of describing it. There's nothing specific about it, right? But where everyone knows sort of what it means. So do you believe in like are there things that are more valuable than current stats that we have that we just can't quantify right now?
Yeah, and I mean, I actually think you actually can even quantify that very specifically because you could look at their entry usage rate, basically, is I think how I previously described it. So like the number of entry duels they take as percentage of total. So, you know, my guess is that Dupree is in the 25-30% range for Astralis, just because those device and Magisk are so passive, at least like if you adjust device for like the op duels that really are not like entry duels the same way because you're just holding angles aggressively, etc. So, you know, I like that's just a much harder role, I think, particularly to be consistent on, and it's a more pressure role, I think, in many ways. So I think there's definitely there's like you definitely should ascribe different levels of value and also difficulty to different roles on the team, I think, for sure. You can kind of approximate many of these things, I think, from stats today, but there's nothing that kind of tries to separate them. Like you look at the stats lines of Simple, ZywOo, and Device, and you know they might look very similar statistically, but like the way those are put together and like the kills that go into those numbers are very different.
In fact, actually, I'll give you one that was on the top of my head, because something I know I messaged you about recently, which is when people have been having this whole ZywOo versus Simple debate, right? Which is a totally legit debate, by the way. Like, I'm not one of these idiots who thinks that you have to think your guy is definitely the best and the other guy sucks, you know. I actually hate those debates where people take 1A, 1B discussions and they make it like one guy's 4 times better than the other one. Like, I'll give you an example. At the time of recording this video, no one technically knows whether Patrick Mahomes or Aaron Rodgers will win the MVP this season. Right? I'll just tell you right now, as a massive Aaron Rodgers fan, I'll be totally fine if Patrick Mahomes wins it. Like, it's not that big a difference that we have to go crazy. Now, I would say that would actually be an interesting discussion where we could have had this same topic, but on NFL. Like, I would obviously argue things like Aaron Rodgers has way less fucking weapons, etc. And his worse coaching stuff. Like, there's a million angles I would take that are like
so only been in one team with a winning record this year, though. That's a stat for you. It's real.
Blame the NFL for not scheduling anyone to play them then. They've won 12 out of 15 games. It's pretty good. Still pretty good. No, I get the premise though, sure. No, but here's where I would come down on this, right, is so when people are doing those differences, here's an example of something stats can't tell you. It can, obviously, but the current ones we have, just to make it colloquial, can't tell you. Right? I was pointing out to you, the thing I think, actually, I'm going to do a whole video separately on that, is unreal about Simple. It's just, because think about it, right? Everyone's played Counter-Strike so long that when you're looking for little edges to improve in, normally it's just stuff that even like a noob's working on, like I'll work on my grenades or, you know, I'll watch my positions. Simple, it's like he got so bored being the best. He's now trying to like change what being a Counter-Strike player is, because the amount of games you see now where he is just, in the past, right, when he had Zeus on his team, he used to quite famously sometimes swap to play B on Mirage, CT, B, instead of Zeus, just so you couldn't exploit Zeus, because that was like a classic position where it's one of the most exploitable if you have a bad player there, right? It's classic that you do. In fact, famously, you even put your bad player there because almost no one can hold those positions properly, like to make it worthwhile. Like, you're better off having your good player, connector or fucking ticket booth or something like those are the real spots. Yeah, of course. So basically, Simple famously used to sometimes swap out then, but people at the time thought he's just doing that because he's Simple and he's Zeus. Like, the disparity is so insane, it's worth even a gamble. Essentially, on a bunch of maps, Simple just does that whenever he wants now on CT side. Like, he effectively just decides in a way that, if you think about it, it's actually genius if you could do it. Like, I'll just pick the spot they're probably going to come to now. I'll go there, and since I'm the best player in the world, I'll just kill them all. Like, in some ways, he's actually like, the reason it's kind of genius is because, like, first of all, almost no one else could do it. So it's not like anyone else is sitting down and choosing whether they do this. But if you could do it, it actually does, like, make up for, like, essentially you pick up the slack for a bunch of teammates that couldn't hold that spot in that situation. But what I'm getting to is, at the end of the game, the scoreboard's just going to tell me how many kills and deaths he got, the same as ZywOo. Even if ZywOo's in the same spot 15 rounds on CT side. So, like, there's an example to me already where it's not that, like, stats can't tell us it. Like I said, again, we could easily track those things. It's just that at the moment we don't even attempt to look for that, do we? We just kind of just look at the final number.
Yeah, and I mean, I do think there's well, I know there's some platforms that I think already do some of this in like private. I don't know how many teams actually use it. Like, I recall Device a couple years ago specifically saying that he started spending a bunch of time just like looking at where oppers go early on in the round and like seeing where he goes early on in the round.
Yes.
Just to like see like how people are scouting him. I mean, it's very basic stuff. It's not like very, very high level, but I recall, like, for example, when we were still building out the 16.0 platform, like we had stuff like you could like select like a little box on a map and it would just show you how many times someone goes in that area within, like, you could select a certain time frame during a round. So for example, if you're playing Device, you could just pick Device and then like you could see like how his movements work during the round. So he plays like, starts off this area and there's like some area here because he's sometimes here, but almost always here. And then like over the round, it always ends with like him playing this area because it's his spot, that sort of thing. I think stuff like that eventually, I think is going to be much more useful. And I think once you start including that in how you view players, not just in like game preparation, but also their impact, I think is when you can do what you were kind of talking about, which is, if you get 30 kills, 30 is 30, but if you get 30 kills playing A-Rail on Dust 2 on CT side versus just like floating all the way around the map, my guess is that your impact on being disruptive is much greater if you're all the way around the map, because you're just having a bigger impact on how the other team is playing if you're the superstar of that team. So I actually think that stuff is not very hard to do already. You have very good access to all that information in like demo files and not game logs anymore, but demo files. So it's actually pretty easy to do. My guess is there are teams who have built some of this themselves and use it, but they probably don't. I mean, they don't talk about it. They could also be they don't talk about it on purpose because they don't want other people to know it. But I think there's a lot of cool stuff that you can do that I think that people are already doing, and that's like very beneficial both for preparing for playing against other teams. Because even just getting like a 5% better guess of which area of the map you might stack on an anti-eco because of where they like to go at some point in the half.
Yes.
Like you win one round because of that. Sometimes that wins you a game, maybe wins you a title. So it's just like a probability thing. I don't know where I was going anymore by the end of that, but I think there's people who are doing that, I think, already, and I think it's very helpful. Oh, and the final piece is like I think it also helps you change your game because the other
teams, Device example, yeah.
So and I think this is the kind of thing that like I don't think the players realistically, or at least like 99.99% of the players are going to be doing themselves. I think it's more so you need a good coach or a good analyst who's going to go to the players and be like, hey, I looked at these like 5 rounds and like this is what you do and this is what they do. So like maybe like adjust this and like be on the lookout for this, that sort of thing. But I think it has to be from like the support staff effectively to really make work, I think.
When fans use that logic, which by the way, a spoiler, will never ever work, which goes like this: I'm pretty sure as a top pro he knows X, Y, and Z. Like, by the way, those pretty sure statements almost always wrong, because like, first of all, what they assume immediately is that to be a pro, I always describe it like this, is like a linear progression, and that by getting to the top level, that pro is, for example, better even in knowledge at everything than me and lurppis do, because he's above us. No, he's obviously just way better at clicking mouse one, isn't he? Like, he's just got better aim. Like, I'm sure people can understand this premise that they think players are smart who aren't the best fraggers. Therefore, they understand that pros have differing skill levels. But basically, where I was going to go to is this. You wouldn't believe, every time I say it on shows, people think I'm like exaggerating when I tell them the majority, I'm talking massive, make it capital letters, fucking majority, we're probably talking like 80-90% of them, top pros don't give a fuck about individual demo research. They're not doing this, which, listen to me, I always thought it was crazy even back in your day, mate, because even back then, if I'm like Forrest or something, and I even just put in an hour a week, the dividends that could pay is so crazy. But the idea they don't do it in, this is why I know they'll never do it unless they're forced to, purposes. If they don't do it in the modern day when they really do make 30k a month and they can literally win $1 million, like, they're never going to do it, mate. You could pay these guys 100 million. And if anything, they'll use the same stupid logic that I'm sure they use now, which I'll just reference. There was an old Immortals team that was a bit like this, where their logic was like, well, how do you do any more work? We've already made it. And it's like, I get where you're coming from that perspective, that you're like, listen, I've already making loads of money. But my point is this, if anything, fans, the fact that they're making all this money and they're successful, but they haven't done it yet, means they'll never do it. Because I've always thought that is nuts to me, mate. Like, I know, I'm not asking people to go crazy and go like, Kobe Bryant or Peyton Manning levels where you just obsess your whole life about this. Well, I get it, not everyone's built that way. But you don't even have to do that. Like, in the modern day, NFL people all know this. You can just get a guy to send you basic breakdowns like, look, here's 5 routes that this guy runs. Here's 4 that you're going to run. Like, here's what to look for when you, like, we're talking simple shit. Like, it's almost Sesame Street levels. They don't make it complicated. But the dividends that'll pay are crazy. And so even though I'm just screaming into the void now, it does still blow my mind that it's so hard to get players on board with this as a principle. It's like they get the idea of watching the demo with the coach, which, by the way, they only get because we made them do it. Then they sort of get that the IGL should watch the demos because he's going to call the strats. But they still don't get somehow. This is why I want to ask you about this. What somehow they still don't get is they don't get how they individually would also benefit in the same way, but a micro version of how the IGL in a macro sense benefits from watching the demo of the whole opposing team. How can they never get that angle? Because I just think to myself, like, I'm excluding geniuses like Simple and Nico. Like, maybe they don't need to do it. They are so unbelievably good and they know their own game up. But if I was like a mid-table player, bro, there's millions of dollars waiting for you to be picked up if you just do this right now. Like, if you play for like Godsent or something, bro, just pause the video right now, write down a post-it note and start doing this, because no joke, you could literally like double your value in this world.
Get one of these. Yeah, I mean, look, I think that the way that many people kind of justify not doing it, and I've heard this a million times, is either nobody else is doing it either. So like, like I will burp on like fair ground, even ground. And the other thing is that like, well, like sometimes I've done it and then like I've done the wrong thing because I reacted the wrong way. So like I'm better off just focusing on my game. That's a classic cliche. I will say, just based on the experience. So for example, if we think about the EG team that I was on, so me and Good for Nothing used to watch a bunch of demos and like try to prepare for things, but we noticed that the times that we made everybody watch the demos and like kind of like talked about it ahead of time, people were just confused and like would completely sometimes like alter the way they played, like to like a ridiculous extreme where it's like, oh, like they like to do this on these rounds, so like I just waited for this one thing for the entire half and it never happened. It's
right.
Like that's not how you're supposed to, like when you think about what they might be doing, like maybe if you know that they're more likely, you change your play style by like expecting the probability of that happening by 5 percentage points instead of it all being flat. Like that's how you should think about it. It's a probability distribution. So like for example, in that team, what we used to do is we would gather all the information ourselves and we would try to like sprinkle it at like opportunistic times in the game, and we found that like that actually worked better. I do think that there's some people who are just like very smart, some players specifically. For example, the names that you mentioned, I'm sure there's many others where like they kind of just instinctively pick up a lot of this stuff. So
yes.
Like I've had teammates where they're just like confused about like reads where, like we're playing a game and you say like, well, like we practiced against these guys, like 2 months ago and they did this and this and then like this happened and like I think they're gonna do this, and they're like, what? It's like speaking French to me now, and like they just like can't imagine, because I think like many people just don't pay attention like naturally, and then there's other people who kind of pick up on a lot of it. My guess is that many of the like all-time greats, generally speaking, are very smart about all of this, even if they don't really talk about it. It's like I think we maybe even made this point in a previous episode. It's like the stuff where like LeBron talks about like the sequences of the game. Like, of course, like like I think every smart Counter-Strike player will be able to tell you all that stuff, like what happened,
the obvious
like,
example
happened,
that,
like
by
what
the way,
drove those decisions.
I don't know if you remember this, but I know a classic example is that people have seen on broadcasts is that Get Right is very much like that. Now, I'll tell you again, he's not watching every demo, he's just remembering from games he saw. It's like what you're saying. Basically, he just has a great eye for detail, I'm assuming from playing, and his brain's sort of doing like an analog version of what we're talking about. Like, instead of actually like taking notes and studying it with a stat statement, he's just doing like an analog version of that, I'm guessing, as he watches anything.
Yeah. And I think there's, for a bunch of people that works, and then there's many others for whom it doesn't work. It's sort of the difference between, like some people do better if they skip class the entire term and then, go through the slides the day before the exam. And I think some people, like, they just can't pick up anything doing that. Some people do better with road memorization than others. And, I think people just kind of have to figure out what works for them, what doesn't, and then try to work around that to get to the point they need to go.
Like, basically, one area I'll tie this in, this is going to sound like a tangent, but it's a good one. Basically, we won't do it on this podcast for obvious reasons. For start, we haven't got 2 more hours. But, like, when people do the whole Michael Jordan versus LeBron debate, right? Because it's obviously a super hot topic now because LeBron's still active, still winning the championship. Like, all the markers are there to make it a key discussion point, basically. And spoiler for anyone who doesn't know, that will continue for the rest of your life, however long you live. Like, that just goes. The whole point of those debates is they're not supposed to ever end. There's another great line for you. Debates like that aren't supposed to be decided. There's that great fucking quote, I think it's Archimedes or something, or Aristotle, where it says, like, it says, like, wise men argue cases, fools decide them. Because the whole point is, the reason they're cases is there is no fucking right answer, is there? You sort of decided for yourself what the answer. But basically, when people come down to that one area I know you actually have a take, which is a really great take people can apply to esports, but people don't do it in sports, sadly. Because sports is kind of more about dumbing it down so that like every pleb watching CNN or whatever, I don't know what the fucking sports, the ESPN, I guess, can enjoy it, right? Basically, what they do instead is they just say stuff like, is he the best now? And it's like, yes, no. And then what they don't ever do, though, is what you do, which is like, right, well, then scientifically, if you're saying that you've got real metrics, you're not just doing it like, I prefer this guy. You think there's a real answer. Well, if there's an answer, it's based on certain criteria and an equation somewhere, however vaguely that equation is defined in your brain. So I know one of the things you often make the point of, which I think is a great angle, is if someone says, by the way, I'd be one of them, Michael Jordan is better than LeBron, the follow-up question isn't, why do you hate LeBron? Or the follow-up question is obvious. It goes like this. Okay, then what does LeBron have to do before he meets your criteria? That's the great question to ask, right? Because if they can't answer it, by the way, they've actually just fucking exposed themselves completely that it was basically like a rigged game and they were never going to allow the other guy to win. Now, true, they're probably going to answer it equally uselessly by going, but he has to never lose in the finals. Like, well, he can't go back in time, can he? So you can't do that. But listen, I'm just saying that to be silly because obviously that would be the angle they'd use. But my point is this, right? When it comes down to topics like that, so that's like a sport example, but there's a million in CS, obviously. If it's like a LeBron versus Jordan one, and how much of that would you use eye test if it's you making the decision for yourself? How much would you bring stats into that? Would you try and like do some comparison? Would you mainly go off would it go off feel? How would you make a decision like that for yourself?
Well, I think it depends a little bit on the type of the decision, like we talked about earlier. So if it's something that I feel like I have a pretty good grasp on, and like, I watched, like, for example, like say Simple against ZywOo, I've watched both of them for hours and hours and hours. So I have like a decent grasp, much more so than if we're comparing like RPK against Boomich, for example. For that, like I'd feel like I'd have to do much more work. I'd probably have to rely more on the stats than just like what I've seen. But the way I've always tried to do it, and I think the reason that a lot of people think that I just like fully rely on stats much more so than I actually do, is that I just use stats to kind of back up my opinion. So I basically look for stuff that helps prove it, because then I think that's the actually useful way of looking at stats, that you have hypothesis and then you kind of look for proof that it's true. Obviously, there's no like definitive proof, but the more things that you can stack in your favor, the more likely it is that you're not at least completely off base. So, I mean, for something like that, that's a bit of a more known quantity. I think that would kind of have my own view just based on eye test, et cetera, and then I would kind of look at things that support it or go against it. But then the other example, so let's say Apex or RPK against Boomich, or flay me, I think I would start from the other place first. Because like I just like those guys don't get hours of screen time every time their teams play. You probably don't remember like 8,000 highlights and like great plays they made because they probably just didn't, or at least that wasn't on the screen at the time that was made. So I think for those you probably want to rely more on the supporting stuff.
So okay then, listen, we're not going to do a massive episode about it, but I'll ask you about it now because we can tie it into what we've just discussed earlier. When you do yours for this year, if you have to decide who you think is the best player this year, is it Simple? Is it ZywOo? Now, listen, obviously, chuck out the window all the factors of like some of it was online and there was all that shit. And I'm sure
the rankings this year will be wild.
Oh, it's going to be crazy.
Online.
Of course, yeah. No, I mean, sadly, I can already tell you there's going to be some that'll be whack. Because I'll give you an example. I've no doubt because they won every tournament. Like, you probably have to put that Dexter guy from fucking Renegades on the list, right? Because he won every tournament in his region, pretty much. The problem is, if he gets on the list, it's unfair because it's kind of like, he didn't get
players. Big's going to have 2 players in the top 20.
Probably, even though that's an atrocity in itself, but I get you.
I bet OG is going to have 2 players too.
So, like, basically, where do you come down? Like, who is yours? I actually haven't asked you this. Who would your player for this year be?
I don't know that I have a firm answer, but I think just based on like what I've without doing any of the work on it, I think I'm leaning Simple. I think taking into account like the highs of the year for them and also like his performance is just unbelievable. I went back a couple of weeks ago and I think I tweeted about it. I found that tweet from I think when they got knocked out of one of the E-League majors in early 2018. And I said something like, well, like it's, real shame that they got knocked out because he's playing like some of the best Counter-Strike anybody's ever played. And he responded saying, form gonna be better, trust me. And then like he's basically just played at like an even better level than ever before, nonstop since then for almost 3 years now. I think since that event. So I mean, to me, he's been the most impressive player this year. I think ZywOo actually might in some ways be more flashy, might have more memorable rounds. I don't know. It just seems like what Simple's doing in the context of that team where it's really it's a 2-man band.
Yes.
And it's a 2-man band. Like it just is like the stuff that he's doing in the context of that framework and like what he has to do for them to even be competitive is just unbelievable. I mean, people make fun of him for like being annoyed, whatever, when they're losing. He's like faces on the streams when they lose rounds. I mean, just imagine how it's going. Like that guy is go into these games thinking like, all right, so I'm gonna have to get 100 kills in this best of 3, or we almost certainly have no chance of winning. Like that's your attitude every time, and you come out, you finish like plus 30, and you're like, well, got us to a close third map. And that's just like your life day in, day out. And you're like, well, if I pushed myself from averaging 90 kills in a best of 3 to 95, that might get us some wins. In the meantime, you have teammates who just aren't good enough to compete against Astralis, etc. Yes. That's they're good players, by the way, but like maybe not in the right situation, not the right team, but like certainly like not doing enough to support those 2 guys. Because Electronic's also really amazing. It's like one of the best players in the world for second, third year in a row.
Because one area I will totally admit, some of these discussions, it's also the reason why, in my opinion, the eye test has to be the ultimate, is because the eye test is the one thing that you can actually trust there's something like real behind, in a sense, even though actually it's the most, in theory, the most ephemeral, because it's just what you see and what you feel based on it. The reason I bring that up, though, is because I notice every time we try to contrast people like this, unless we're just contrasting a stat on a screen, which itself has so much extra information going into it that's ignored, it just becomes people arguing things that they're sort of third order effects. I'll give you an example. Like if I'm contrasting Simple and ZywOo, I already start in my mind, because obviously my content is based on like being able to communicate these ideas to people who don't know that much about the game and aren't experts, because if they were experts, I wouldn't be doing the video for them, obviously. Basically, if I explain to them my reasons why, a lot of my reasons aren't even my primary reasons, because my primary reasons would be things like just wax lyrical about how awesome the AWPing is or how we advanced to this position. So really, you'd have to have a demo AWP, you'd have to be freeze framing it, I'd have to like pause and give a 20-minute diatribe about why this matters. So if I'm going off secondary or tertiary elements, it's going to be things like what you were trying to do there, like trying to gauge the teammates. So for example, I actually think the teammates one got even more interesting, because back in the day when Simple still had Zeus, actually I always was very fair about this. I never used to do that thing of like it's all Simple's success that makes them win, and it's all Zeus's fault they didn't win. Because I was always like, listen, I've followed the game long enough to know, no matter how much of a moron he might be in some senses, Zeus clearly was a fucking great in-game leader, and he definitely knew his own style completely inside and out, like all the great in-game leaders do. And so some of that is him doing that as well. Like, I think people have probably seen, now that he doesn't have Zeus, there's certain things he does lack in terms of what his in-game leader brings. I don't think Boomich is anywhere close to what Zeus was. But at the same time, if I go over to the other side of the equation, so this year, I don't think Simple has a great IGL. On the other side, Apex in theory isn't a great IGL, but he has done a great job. He's got a great coach. So actually, I think the whole team angle, you can do a lot of comparisons, but it's really fraught, actually. Like, I think they all have pros and cons in different areas. Like, because I noticed one area I found kind of a bit whack is people have kept the same narrative for both players. So with Simple, they basically go your angle of like, well, he's got electronic. Well, if you use that angle, listen, I'll tell you right now, there's nobody on Vitality that's comparable to electronic. But it isn't just who's your next best teammate. It's also like, how good is your team? Tell you what, if I had to pick teams, I'm picking fucking Vitality over Navi any day of the week. Look how good their team is. Like, their team looks amazingly coached, very well set up. Even the players who statistically do badly somehow seem to contribute to the overall win. There's a massive area that's different, right? In Navi, if a player does badly statistically, he'd probably cost you the fucking game. Like, I know people try to argue maybe Perfecto does stuff like it's just fail or whatever, but some of those players, Flamey's probably the most egregious example. He just looks like he loses your games sometimes. If RPK has the same number of frags that Flamey does, he probably did something with those. Like, where do you come down on those aspects? Because those are hard to frame, right? They're basically, it's almost just like a court case. You're just trying to win someone over. You're not really making like an answer. There's not an answer to those questions, right?
By the way, Flamey might be the weirdest lost talent in the CIS, particularly given that he's been playing together with Simple for years and years.
Oh,
and
he has
years
no
now.
excuses,
and
right? Does he?
The amount of tournament wins that he could have gotten if he were a little bit better is like the swing factor, and like we've seen him be that good. There was that tournament, like this is one of the early like ESL, ESCA Pro League finals when he was combined for the two at the end.
It was season 2. It's the one they lost to Fnatic.
I think he was the MVP, even though they lost the final.
And the 2015,
it's like unbelievable.
It's when he had like 100 frags over like a 5-map series, if people remember.
Yeah, no, just he was fantastic, and then like he's just kind of. I've kind of just waited for a couple of years for him to just kind of wake up and bounce back and like get like turn into a really good player. Just like at a time when like he could really swing a lot of the games over when they're losing close games. It just never really got in there. I mean, I tend to agree with you in like the broad scope. So I think Vitality is a better team than Navi for sure. I think if you took Simple or ZywOo out of those teams, I think Navi's worse than ZywOo. Not that that's like the way of looking at it.
Yes.
But I agree on the in-game leader front. I think they're probably similar, though my suspicion is that Vitality is like better coached and better prepared overall. So I think for Apex, the job is probably easier than it is for Boomich. But, again, this is looking from the outside in.
That's where I suspect the online aspect might be skewing it.
Yeah, I think online, I think you're going to see much more value getting out of, coming out of having good in-game leaders next year. Because I think this year, many of the teams have had their coaches kind of just calling 24/7 is my suspicion. Sure. And like that obviously makes the job a lot easier for the people who are not necessarily super comfortable as in-game leaders or, not used to doing that all the time. Again, for reference, I think the hardest thing about being a caller is not making the right calls like 4 times a half. It's making pretty good calls the entire half and then having like the mental fortitude to make the right call, those like deciding moments. There's a lot of people, who are not callers say like, I think that's why both Coldzera and Nico started calling at times is because they thought that they were just really good at making those right calls, those like 4 times a half. But, that's not all of it. Like the prerequisite is that you make pretty good calls for the entire half and then that puts you over the top. And it's a lot easier to make those calls just on the side if you don't have to do the whole thing for the whole half.